So I should say from the outset that usually I never I never talk about recent events or current film related events here on this channel. But recently, of course, we got the news about how the world lost the iconic actor, Mr. Sean Connery. So, Mr. Sean Connery passed away very recently. And I just wanted to break my sort of unspoken rule, as it were, if you don't mind, and just share with you just a few comments about Sean Connery, because I mentioned it in passing, but he was one of my absolute favorite actors, and that's due to a number of reasons. One of the primary reasons, in fact, is it's because my mother, when she was alive, she absolutely adored Sean Connery, and she would be so excited whenever we could watch a Sean Connery film on TV, or if we could rent a Sean Connery film from the local VHS store. And so that would mean, for instance, watching films like Hitchcock's Marnie, or maybe Murder on the Orient Express, or the James Bond films and the like. And also it meant being really excited whenever there would be a new Sean Connery film that would be released in the theaters. And so if we think back, this was around the 80s and the 90s, the early 90s. And so that meant being really excited whenever a new Sean Connery film would be released in theaters. So this meant watching The Presidio, or watching The Russia House, or watching films like Rising Sun. Do you remember the film Rising Sun? What an interesting film that is. And also Dragonheart, right? The film with Dennis Quaid, right? And other films, of course. And one film in particular that she loved so much, and my dad too loved so much, and I went with them in the theater, was The Hunt for Red October. Wow, what a film to watch in the theater. Now, I was a kid when I saw that for the first time, so a lot of it went over my head, but it was still enough of an action thriller pace film such that I could follow along for some of it anyway. Again, I was quite young. But one of the things I associate that film so much with is my mom, and just how happy she was. And I looked over to her and just looked at her face, and she was smiling and just really into the film, especially when you'd see Sean Connery on screen. And so her face would just light up. And so I have so many fond memories of my parents, and of my mother in particular, whenever I watch a Sean Connery film, such that now I think those films, I have such fond memories associated with my mother whenever I watch a Sean Connery film. So that's one of the main reasons why I'm so into the works of the films starring Sean Connery. There are a number of films, a lot of films in his really interesting filmography. It's really interesting. I wish I could talk about all of his films, but if I had to pick a few, for instance, if someone were to ask me what films I would recommend to watch that stars Sean Connery, I would probably go. There are so many to offer. It's probably not for everyone, but I love Zardos. I remember seeing that for the first time when it was broadcast on TV in the UK. And I was, as I say, I was just a kid growing up, and I saw this film, and I was thinking, what is going on? This is one of the most bizarre experiences I think I'm encountering, and it just became this really, really eccentric view of a certain perspective. And ever since then, it's been such a fascinating thing. That film, Stardust, is so fascinating for a lot of reasons, not least of which being the Sean Connery performance. Wow, what a performance that is. But if I had to recommend other films with Sean Connery, I would of course maybe draw people's attention to the James Bond films. But of course, maybe you don't need me to do that, because the James Bond films, of course, are so famous, absolutely famous, and I love all of them. I love all of them for their own specific reasons. And if I had to pick oh gosh, I don't know if I can pick one, but as an example of a film that I really love with Sean Connery, From Russia with Love. From Russia with Love. That is, wow, that is one of the best. It seemed to me to have such a great blend of charm and chemistry and urgency and danger and sensitivity and risk, and also James Bond as detective, James Bond as spy, and not quite knowing what's going on and putting the pieces together, and just and all captured in that wonderful Sean Connery performance. And the like. And I know people maybe have, there might be some mixed reactions to films like, say, Diamonds Are Forever, but I think Diamonds Are Forever is a really fascinating one. And some of you may know that I'm doing a series of live streams talking about each of the Bond films. Well, I cannot wait until we get to Diamonds Are Forever, because I think there's so many. I love that film so much for a number of reasons, and one of them is the Sean Connery performance. So I hope to be able to share with you some thoughts I have about that when we get to that live stream, which is hopefully going to be very soon. Going back to the question, if someone asked me what other Sean Connery films I could recommend, I would probably almost immediately draw your attention to one of the great cinema collaborations, one of the great director-actor collaborations that we have seen in modern cinema. And of course, people speak of Kurosawa and Mifune. Many people speak of, say, Scorsese and De Niro. And there's also the great collaboration between Connery, the actor, and the director, Sidney Lumet. So the Lumet-Connery collaborations are sublime. They are rich, they are rewarding, they are vast, quite eclectic, very different from each other if one thinks about it, although there is a strand of connectivity, I would argue, especially among certain works in particular. But that core set of films that make up the cinematic collaboration between Lumet and Connery, wow. So we have The Hill, and the Anderson tapes, and The Offense, and Murder on the Orient Express, and then a later film, Family Business. And so, wow, what a set of films there. Wow, amazing. And the performances by Connery in each of those films, so subtle, so effective in their own respective ways. That is a great core set of films right there. So the Lumet-Connery collaboration, it can't be beat in many respects. It's so cool and so wonderful. So I'd recommend that. I should say also, just in passing, that Murder on the Orient Express, as an example, is one of my absolute favorite films. I love that film to bits. And one of the reasons why I love that film so much is the Sean Connery performance. Colonel Arbuthnot, the pipe-smoking Colonel Arbuthnot. Wow. And it's a relatively supporting role, because it's an ensemble piece, as we know, but still, when he's on, he is really on. I mean, there was a great phrase by Shane Rimmer on one of the James Bond documentaries, I think it was on Diamonds Are Forever, where he talks about Sean Connery being on set, and he says, he's an actor, and I'm paraphrasing, he gives out a lot of voltage, which means he's got a huge electrifying presence whenever he's in the room. And so you can feel that in the films that he's in. So even in a relatively secondary role, like, say, Murder on the Orient Express, he's still, to borrow the great phrase from Shane Rimmer, he gives out a lot of voltage. What a great film that is. One of my absolute favorites. I love Agatha Christie. I love Sidney Lumet. I love Sean Connery. And so you get all of that in one film. Murder on the Orient Express. Wow. Absolutely brilliant stuff. The iron tongue of midnight hath told 12. Brilliant stuff. And but if I had to keep going with Sean Connery film recommendations, I would have to go to a number of other films. So the first, Robin and Marion. I mean, wow, one of the great films ever. And it's so poignant, so touching, and so romantic. And you've got a great screen presence. Sean Connery and Audrey Hepburn, one of my absolute favorites. So emotional, and it really goes for it, and it has such an emotional punch to it. And the Untouchables, yes, the Untouchables. That was another one of my parents' favorite films from the 80s, and of course Sean Connery, so well deserved. All the accolades that he received as Malone, the great character Malone in that film, and some of the performances there, like I don't want to give too much away, but there's a moment in the film, and I'll try to be as vague as possible, where he's telling people if they're cold, he's advising them to stomp their feet. They should stamp their feet in order to make their bodies warm if they're standing around and waiting and surveilling the area, etc. He's saying, just stamp your feet, it'll keep you warm. And so whenever I'm outside in the cold, and maybe I'm waiting around and it's really cold and I can't go inside and I'm chilly, I'll just start almost subconsciously, I guess. I'll just stomp my feet on the ground. And I think that's due to the fact that I saw Sean Connery say something like that, or Malone say that in one of the scenes in The Untouchables. So now whenever it's cold outside, and I'll start to stamp my feet on the ground just to keep my body warm. So thank you very much, Sean Connery, Malone, for that great little bit of advice. I could go on about The Untouchables. I mean, I've spoken about it a little bit before. I mean, one of the great. I'm not good with my impersonations. I never have been. But one of the ones I really like to do is Sean Connery in The Untouchables. It's great, right? Elliot Ness and Sean Connery, right? Elliot Ness and Malone, right? How is he going to get Capone, right? And so what does Malone say? He says, you want to get Capone? Here's how to get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way, and that's how to get Capone. So that's great, What a great film. Stone. George Stone. I love that film so much. And the way he says the word bookkeeper, the way that Sean Connery says the word bookkeeper, you'd think it would be just a random thing, a random word, bookkeeper. But of course we know in the film, and I don't want to say too much, but we know in the film that the word bookkeeper has a certain sense of significance. And the way that Sean Connery says the line, or says the word bookkeeper, wow. And also I should go back to Murder on the Orient Express. I'm not going to say anything more, but the way he says the word, there are two words in two different scenes that I think is so great. Just the nuance and inflection of voice and tone in his voice. Wow, Sean Connery, what a great performance. So Murder on the Orient Express, if you're going to watch it, check out the way he says the word behavior, and also when he says the word greater. He says the word greater in another scene. Wow, it's all in the performance, the way he uses his voice. Wow, what a great performance that was. But if I had to pick a film, if I had to pick one film that was my absolute favorite Sean Connery performance, I don't know if I could pick one, because there are so many to choose from. I mentioned a few already that I really admire, but one actually that I haven't mentioned that could be up there as being one of my absolute favorite Sean Connery performances, though, is the great film, The Man Who Would Be King. And that has one of the best Sean Connery performances. Wow, what a film. That is a complex work. Really complex. And if you talk about Sean Connery, one of the great things that he does is his characters that he inhabits. He is able to show us the weaknesses and fallibilities and shortcomings of those characters. They aren't perfect human beings, the characters that Sean Connery plays. They are oftentimes imperfect, and they have weaknesses to their character. And sometimes those weaknesses overcome what it is that they're trying to do, and that becomes part of the dramatic focus of the stories that they inhabit. Well, I think The Man Who Would Be King is one of those great examples, and how he is able to inhabit this character and show us the good sides and maybe the not so good sides, and still give us a full, rich performance. Yeah, that's one of my. That's one of the best performances that he's given. So if you haven't seen The Man Who Would Be King, the John Huston film, The Man Who Would Be King, you've got to see that. Sean Connery, Michael Caine, what a duo, what a combination. And it has a powerful punch to it. It's emotional. It is funny. It's witty. It's quite shocking in a lot of places, I would say. And it makes for some really compelling viewing. And that's due in large part to the performances, in particular, Mr. Sean Connery. And I don't want to be, I want to be as vague as possible for anyone who hasn't seen the film. But there's a great way that there's a great way that the film relies on, of course, the inspiration from Kipling, and that in turn relies on a particular hymn, Reginald Heber hymn, and it's kind of famous how Kipling and then later Huston, by means of Caine and Connery, do a little bit of interpretation and rearrangement, if you will, of the underlying hymn words. But there's a particular moment that's really grand and epic, and it also, I think, is very befitting Sean Connery, and it's one of the scenes that I think it's very famous. And it's actually, when I heard the news about Sean Connery and his passing, this was the scene that popped into my head immediately. And I won't go into detail about what it is, but it uses the hymn, and it does a little bit of rearrangement actually about the words. And I hope I can remember it, but it's like and it again, it's not quite the same hymn, because there are a little bit of word changes, but the way it's presented in the film is it's really beautiful. And again, if I remember correctly, it's a glorious band, the chosen few, on whom the Spirit came, 12 valiant saints, their hope they knew, and mocked the cross and flame. He met the tyrant's brandished steel, the lion's gory mane. He bowed his head, his death to feel, who followed in his train. Yes. So, as I say, that's a little bit of the Reginald Hebert hymn, rearranged slightly through Kipling and later through Houston and Caine and Connery. But I think that's a very fitting way to remember the great career of one of the great legends, Sean Connery. And I think it's a fitting tribute to one of the great cinematic heroes. And he was an icon, he was a star, and he was a great actor, great performer. So one of my absolute favorites, Sean Connery.